Um, Lucy, thank you very much for joining us today. Our guest speaker today is Lucy Andrews. She co-leads the Unpacking Whiteness program at San Francisco Zen Center with Tova. And she's also a PhD candidate on environmental science at UC Berkeley. So she has done a lot of work about racial justice and also climate climate justice. So thank you very much for joining us today, Lucy. I look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here this morning. If it's okay, I'd love to hear from each of you, just a quick introduction, who you are, and then maybe even just a brief sentence, how you're doing this morning, if you feel excited to share that. So I'm happy to start. My name is Lucy. I use she and her pronouns, and I've had 2 cups of coffee, so I'm feeling good, and it's a pleasure to meet new folks who are asking and interested in similar questions to me. So how about, I see Lee, do you want to go next? Are you willing to unmute yourself and introduce? And then you can call the next person. We'll go like that.
I'm Lee Marcello. I'm feeling pretty good. I've had also 2 cups of coffee and some breakfast, so I'm energized for the day. And I'm just interested to hear what you have to say, so I decided to join in this morning. And my husband Umar is here too, but he's still finishing up the last of his breakfast, so he'll appear later. And let's see, is that Don Monjour? How about you introduce yourself?
Yeah, this morning I'm in one piece, which makes it really easy to get shoes. So yeah, I'm doing great. I'm really looking forward to this talk and to hear what Lucy has to say. Yeah, everything's okay. I'm retired and old, so that's about it. This is my wife, Heidi.
Good morning. I'm also well and happy to hear what's going to be said this morning. And I just want to say hello, Les. So nice to see you.
Oh, you get to nominate the next if you're excited about it.
Yeah, Teresa.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. I'm also doing well. I was kind of tired today, but I took a nap, and I ate a chocolate muffin after the nap, and now I'm fully recovered, full of energy, and very grateful that Lucy accepted the invitation to come to our online Sendo at Canandon. We hope you can visit us in person when we reopen sometime, hopefully in the not too distant future. So thank you. And also thank you, Tova, for connecting me with Lucy. And I'd like to invite Tova to talk next.
Good morning. I'm Tova Green. I'm at San Francisco Zen Center. Had a good morning. I woke up before Zazen. We have an online Zendo too. So I sat, had breakfast, did some reading. I'm really enjoying this day, and I'm very happy to be able to hear Lucy give a longer talk. I enjoy working with you so much, Lucy. And I'm glad to be back at Canandon, see some faces, familiar faces. So much has changed since I actually visited in person before COVID. It's lovely to see those of you who I remember from that time, and to see you, Les. Thanks. And I will call on David.
Good morning. Sorry if I look a little groggy here. I managed to wake up about 1 minute ago, but I'm really glad to be here, and looking forward to hearing what Lucy has to say. And again, thank you, Tova, for making the connection. And let's see, has everyone already spoken or?
Not yet. you are welcome to choose Diane, Casey, Bonnie, or Les.
Oh my goodness, my gallery view is not actually showing everybody. I wonder what's going on here. Anyway, Les, our dear teacher, would you please go next?
Well, thanks for being here, Lucy. I think the topics you're going to talk about are vital topics, and I would love to get engaged in conversations about them. Thank you for taking the time to be here, and I'm looking forward to the next hour or so.
Me too. How about Casey? I see your initials. Are you able to unmute yourself and introduce?
Yes, I'm Casey, and yeah, thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to talk to us. I didn't sleep too well last night, but I'm doing okay. And yeah, I'm very, very much looking forward to your talk to see what more I can do. Thank you.
Okay.
And Diane?
Diane, are you able to unmute yourself and introduce? If now's
Here. I'm here. Like someone else said, I'm old and retired, and I'm usually energetic in the morning. I went out to dinner for the first time last night.
Oh.
And I had a margarita.
Oh.
I can't drink anymore. I just did not feel well at all this morning. And usually I love margaritas and they love me, but it's been a while. So I'm looking forward to Lucy's talk, and I'm not quite for viewing yet. Thank you.
Awesome. And then last but certainly not least, what is up, Bonnie?
Hi, Lucy. I'm really excited for your talk. I'm actually a little tired this morning. It's been a long week of nonstop technical issues and they never seem to end. So a lot of technical work and computer work, but I didn't want to miss your talk because I think it's a really important topic, and I was really inspired by Teresa's description of a chocolate muffin. So I think I'll go get some chocolate and I'll enjoy that while I listen to you.
I highly endorse that. Thanks everybody for humoring me on that. I am a wholehearted believer in Sangha, whether ephemeral or more permanent. And so here we are all as a Sangha, you welcoming me into yours, and I really appreciate it. Helps me feel a little bit more at home in a digital landscape when I've heard people's voices and know that some people are tired. Some people have been thinking about COVID. Some people have been thinking about wildfire. Some people have been eating chocolate muffins. Some people have really caffeinated like me. It's all welcome. So thanks for that. I've prepared a talk. So I'll sort of pull up my notes in a second here. But some of it will use a little bit of screen sharing. And I want to just double check the tech first. Do I have access to that?
So we're going to have to make Lucy a co-host, and then she'll be able to share.
That'd be lovely, if that's easy.
Yep.
I'm the co-host now. What power? All right. Well, great. Then with that, I'll start right in, and this can also be a conversation. So I'll begin with a talk. If people have questions or ideas or want to slow down or speed up, just, wave a hand at me, drop a note in chat, unmute yourself and start talking to me. It's more fun that way, but I'll start with what I've prepared. Which is first that my name is Lucy and I use she and her pronouns. Somebody who's a member of the queer community. I don't like to necessarily assume gender based on appearance, and so I offer my pronouns as a way to sort of remind us of that and allow other folks to do the same as we go. The second is, this is obviously an out loud talk, and I know that speaking and hearing and having information visually on a slide, it's not necessarily accessible to everybody. We all have different ways of learning and processing And so if it would be helpful for you to have a transcript, I can easily set up an auto transcription service. So just let me know in chat if that would be useful. And when I share my slides, I'll do my best to narrate what's on the screen so that you can also hear about it, not just see it. I do this in the spirit of access and disability justice because I want to live in a world in which all people are equally seen and valued and wanted and deemed indispensable, such that accommodation is not seen as a burden, but instead it's an opportunity where we can show each other just how much we love each other. And so if there's anything that I can do to make this more accessible to you, just let me know, whether by speaking up or dropping a note in the chat. And then third, I'm speaking to you from my apartment in Oakland, California. And Oakland is located in Huchun, the unceded territory of the Chochenyo-speaking Lishan Ohlone people. And I'll throw up a quick map of the Bay Area in a way that many folks don't often see it. Are you able to see a map on the screen?
Yes.
Great. In doing a land acknowledgement here, I'd like to note a few things. First is that the Ohlone people have stewarded what is now known as the East Bay since time immemorial and continue to do so. There have been and are many Ohlone tribes in this region, and each has its own unique culture, history, and geography. I offer this land acknowledgement as a way to fight the invisibilizing of Indigenous peoples by white settler colonialism, past and present. Second, in the land acknowledgement, I'd like to note that this territory of the East Bay where I live is unceded, namely that it was seized by force. When the Spanish arrived in the Bay Area, they embarked on a project of missionization that ultimately amounted to enslavement and genocide. And the United States then continued this project as it colonized the West Coast and established the state of California. And currently, dozens, if not hundreds, of sacred Ohlone sites like the West Berkeley Shell Mounds, the Emeryville Shell Mounds are threatened by development. And against this centuries-long history of violence, the Ohlone people have persisted and continue to fight for their land, their culture, and their sovereignty. And lastly, as the closing of this land acknowledgement, I hope that you'll do something with this information, something that begins to attend to the United States' program of Indigenous dispossession and ultimately genocide. You should learn about the Indigenous histories of the places you call home, and you should consider ways to give the land back. I know that sounds radical to many folks, and I think it is radical because radical action is what is called for against a backdrop of such violence, the causes and conditions that we have inherited. In the Bay Area, you can pay what is known as a Shumi land tax to the Segura Te Land Trust, which is an Indigenous-led, urban, women-led land trust that facilitates rematriation or the return of Indigenous land to Indigenous peoples in the Bay Area. When we're all done with this, I can put a link in the chat if that's of interest to you. I pay an annual land tax for being an occupier here, not as permission for my occupation, but as one way to atone for and repair the conditions that I've inherited. So with that, I'll bring back my face, get rid of the map. I'll start with a little bit more about me specifically. To start, on paper, I'm a PhD candidate in environmental science at UC Berkeley. I study how water resources, particularly rivers and dams, can be managed to adapt to climate change, to promote biodiversity, and to really center and further climate justice. And of course, each of us is more complex than our resumes suggest. I'm also a high school cross-country coach. I'm an endurance athlete. I'm a Buddhist practitioner, and I'm a racial justice organizer and activist, however imperfect I may be in any one of these pursuits. I'm a cisgender, queer white woman with class privilege, and the ways that I show up in the world here that I'm naming are all intertwined. And so I think it's pretty important to offer a full accounting because these are the social locations that, at least in part, inform the perspectives that I'll be offering today and the questions that are most alive for me. I am a product of my history. And I came to Buddhist practice about 6 years ago. At the time, I had just moved to San Francisco after graduating from college, and I was desperately lonely. And in retrospect, I was dealing with some depression. And I, at the time, could not seem to climb out of the depths of low mood that I was experiencing, but a physician that I trusted suggested that I consider mindfulness training as a way to relate differently to the heaviness that I felt. And so I found a mindfulness-based stress reduction program, or what is called MBSR, through UCSF, and just decided to give it a go. I was about 23 at the time. And MBSR, if you're not familiar with it, is a very secular packaging of contemplative practices, particularly those in Buddhist traditions. And the first night of the MBSR class, the teacher instructed me to close my eyes and notice my body, however I could best access that sensation of embodiment, even just the basic fact that I have a body. And so I did as I was instructed, and before I even had time to put words to this novel sensation of the awareness of my embodiment, I was crying, eyes closed. And so, of course, I thought, oh, there's something here. There's something to pay attention to. There's something to look further into. And so after the MBSR class ended 8 weeks later, I started hanging around Zen Center, San Francisco Zen Center, because something about the quiet that was available there felt comforting to me. And I appreciated the teachings that I was starting to get to know during the Saturday morning public Dharma talks. Teachings about non-harming and interbeing and the Bodhisattva vow. And in the process of learning and sitting, I came to realize that the Dharma struck me as simply true, that it was really quite simple. It was true. And at the time, in parallel to my growing love for the Dharma, I was also growing up and waking up to the conditions of the world. The decades of one's 20s can be a tumultuous time. I had spent much of my youth in suburban Minnesota, which is one of the whitest and most homogenous places that I can imagine. And my world expanded a bit in college as I met friends from other countries, other places in the US, other races, just other life experiences. And many of these folks were generous and vulnerable enough to share with me stories of their never-ending experiences of racism that perpetuated for them day after day, and to which, as somebody in a white body, were not apparent. I was not paying attention. And so in realizing my ignorance, my delusion, so to speak, I started working with other white folks on understanding and countering our own white supremacist conditioning. And I'll pause there on that phrase, white supremacist conditioning, to really precisely point at what I mean. When I use the term white supremacy, I'm speaking about ways of relating and governing and valuing that center and elevate whiteness, white people, white culture, white knowledge, white histories. It's this idea that whiteness is normal and desirable, and in fact, with those words, quote unquote, supreme. I know the term white supremacy can evoke images of Nazis and Klan members for folks, and that's certainly white supremacy in a particularly violent form. But white supremacy is also the fact that our United States Senate right now is 91% white. It's the fact that many textbooks still that we use in our schools purport that the Civil War was about states' rights. It's this pervasive rhetoric of inclusion rather than equity. The idea that we need to just invite people of color to inhabit racist spaces without actually dealing with the fundamental oppressive structures and patterns of behavior that undergird these spaces. So that's how I conceive of white supremacy. And we can certainly discuss terms and definitions later in the more conversational portion of this morning. So if you've got ideas you want to talk about or questions, please, definitely note those and we can talk about them soon. So anyway, we can speed the story up a bit. After a few years living in San Francisco, I'd been working with cities across California on water efficiency programs. I popped over to the East Bay for this PhD program in which I'm now enrolled in environmental science at Berkeley. And now that we've arrived at the East Bay phase of my life, I would like to talk about a pivotal experience that at this point thoroughly informs the way that I view racial justice activism and the future that I want to build with other people. But first, I want to offer a bit of a heads up that I'll be discussing physical violence. And hearing about violence may stir stuff up for you. And if you know that this is the case and now that wouldn't be welcome, I fully understand. About the next 5 or 6 minutes of this talk will dwell on an experience of violence. So if you need to step away for this portion, feel free to do that. And regardless of your own history, I hope that you can honor your body, mind's needs here. Noticing breath or constriction or stiffness without judgment can be a good place to start. And for me personally, I'm able to talk about this now with a degree of dispassionate remove because I worked with a trauma therapist for a few months to acknowledge and allow for and work with my own body mind. So on to the story. A little more than a year ago, I chose to walk home from the UC Berkeley campus after my midday class. That was a pretty unusual choice for me. I would usually take the BART or the bus home because the walk is more than 3 miles. And so it took considerable time. But it was a beautiful day, and I was looking forward to the chance to move my legs. And I was about a mile from my apartment on a tree-lined residential street. If you know Oakland, I was in Rockridge, when a hand grabbed my shoulder and roughly spun me around. And in that moment, a young man stood in front of me. And in the shock of that moment, the first thing that registered was a handgun pushing into my stomach. And I don't remember what this young man said, but the message was certainly clear. Give me your backpack. And in my backpack was my laptop and my wallet. And in that moment of adrenaline, I did not think. I reacted purely on instinct. And so with that gun pressed into my navel, I said no. And a split second later, I realized, oh, I think I'm about to be shot. But then I was on the ground, and my head was ringing because my assailant had pistol whipped me a few times. So he had been beating my head with the butt of his gun. And then he disappeared into a car and just sped off. I still had my backpack. And in that moment, totally not knowing what to do, feeling stunned and confused and adrift, I wanted to pretend that nothing had happened, that I was fine, even that my evening would be mundane. So I got up and started walking home. But after about a half a block, the ache in my head had turned into a throb, and my body started to sort of feel flooded with pain and adrenaline. And I reached up to touch my ear. My hand came back covered in blood. And so I realized slowly and then all at once that I could not hear out of that ear, and I was not okay. I needed help. So in that moment, who would I call? What should I do? And I did what I had been taught I should do in crisis, which is that I called 911. And I gave the dispatcher my location and a description of what had happened. And then an eternity passed. I stood, crying and even just kind of wobbling on a street corner. And about 15 minutes later, a police officer arrived. And then shortly after that, an ambulance. And the officer got out of his car and quickly started asking me questions whose answers were necessary to file a police report. And so I offered a narrative of what had happened, even though at the time it was not clear to me, because my memory of the event was and still is a series of pretty disjointed flashes of the bewilderment and unexpected pain and fear. It's not a cohesive story for me. I got a concussion, so I don't remember much, certainly not the information that's plugs right into a form. But I do remember 2 questions that the officer asked. The first one he asked that stands out to me was for a suspect description. I barely knew what my attacker looked like. Quite frankly, I cannot remember the color of his apparel, even though he was standing just a foot away from me. And it felt in that moment like saying anything beyond young and male and giving a description of his skin color, anything beyond that would be pure supposition. And knowing that my description would be vague, how could offering it help in any way? And the answer is that it couldn't. There are tens of thousands of people in the Bay Area who could match the few notes that I could give. But the officer at the time, for reasons that I understand, did not appreciate my poor memory or my hesitancy to answer questions that only served, in my opinion, to serve a profiling effort rather than the apprehension of an actual suspect. At that point in my life, I knew enough to know that police disproportionately harass, intimidate, and arrest Black and brown folks, particularly young men, in ways that are both inhumane and do not reflect true patterns of criminality. And we can return to that term criminality later if we want, and consider how that's actually a constructed term rather than something natural or inevitable. But returning to my interaction with this police officer, he then asked me a second question that stands out in my memory, even as I had a pounding headache and couldn't hear out of one ear. And, you know, my body was starting to experience what I would probably call a degree of shock and emotional overwhelm. The officer asked me in that moment, standing on a street corner with blood gushing out of my head, whether I wanted to press charges if they found a suspect. And I remember thinking, press charges? What charges specifically? What would that mean for me? What would that mean for my attacker? Charges? And I now know from the vantage point of retrospection that the charges would have been something along the lines of felony aggravated battery with a deadly weapon. A charge that, you know, if someone is found guilty of, carries a multi-year sentence in prison. And felony convictions and time in prison change a person's life irrevocably and forever. And so in that moment of overwhelm and pain and shutdown, I gave the only answer I had, which was, I don't know. I do not know if I want to press charges. And so the police officer finished his report. He was literally writing with a clipboard. And the EMTs in the police or in the ambulance checked me out. And the officer then offered me a ride home. But at that moment, the idea of getting into a dark car with bars on the back seat next to a male stranger who was carrying multiple weapons, that was unimaginable to me. And so I declined his offer of a ride and called a friend instead. My friend took me to the emergency room, where I spent the next 4 hours having the condition of my skull, my brain, and my hearing evaluated. And in the months after this assault, I received trauma care from physicians and from therapists. And after a frustrating back and forth with medical providers and insurance companies and state agencies, this back and forth lasting more than a year, I have been fully reimbursed for my healthcare bills by the State Victim Compensation Fund, and I am now very fine. My hearing is back to normal, and I move through the world essentially without fear stemming from this incident. I can still recall the embodied sensation and the terror of having a gun burrowing into my stomach, but otherwise it's almost as though the assault never happened, except that it did. And in doing so, it has forced me to reckon with harm and justice and repair and policing and racism in terms that are actually deeply personal and in ways that feel complicated at this interface of my life and the systems that govern a lot of the ways that public life happens. And so looking at it now from this perspective of hindsight, what happened? How did this experience come to be? And how could it have been different? What's a way of understanding that experience that incorporates Dharma and the visions that I hold for racial justice and radical liberation? And so the first conclusion that I draw is that I would have preferred that the event never happened. I think that's a pretty natural thing. I think that everyone who experiences harm tends to wish that the harm had never happened. I believe that all beings have Buddha nature, an inherent goodness, and that Buddha nature, as we are taught, can be clouded by greed and hatred and delusion. In this interpretation, I don't see harming behavior as natural. When a person causes harm, to me, that suggests the presence of causes and conditions that have created and perpetuate a cycle of harm. So as they say, hurt people hurt people. And I will never know why this man did what he did. But I know that when I refused to give him my backpack in a moment in which I was not thinking, I was reacting, the look in his eyes actually matched the look in mine. We were both deep in the trenches of confusion and pain and regret. And I can hypothesize now about the conditions that would have created true safety for me and that would have prevented that moment. What I've researched, what I've experienced, and what I know of the Dharma tells me that crime, as we think of it, is actually socially constructed. Crime, or more broadly, harm, arises in a state in which there's not enough, whether that not enoughness is real or perceived. So there's not enough money, not enough hope, not enough connection or meaning or insight, not enough opportunity, or even something simple like not enough food. Creating the conditions of my safety, which really is all of our safety, would require that everyone has enough. And having enough, to me, means community. It means housing. It means income. It means education. To create the conditions of safety, we need to take care of people and take care of them in ways that are not contingent, but are instead rooted in the fact that everyone is a human being and as such deserves to flourish on their own terms. It also requires that we reckon with inherited patterns of mass harm that work to keep people from living full and dignified lives. These conditions that attempt to rob people of their right to acceptance and love and self-determination, and sometimes even the chance to live at all. And so I'm talking here about racism and colonialism and classism, all of these forms of oppression that are based in false, but nonetheless impactful ideas of who matters and who doesn't, and who gets to benefit at whose expense. And a second lesson from this vignette here is that I did not receive what I needed after I was beaten. When I called for help, I was met by a tired man with a gun who filled out paperwork. That's not to say that the paperwork was not necessary or that this man wasn't doing the best he could, given the conditions of his employment and the situation. But rather, this is to say that paperwork in that situation seemed to matter more than my well-being. What I needed at the time was someone to negotiate trauma with a person who's recently experienced it. I then needed someone who would make the apparatus of insurance companies and the state work in my favor, rather than engage me in this 12-month battle for reimbursement of medical expenses. That reimbursement was both materially and symbolically important to me. And in having my claims denied for what ultimately amounted to minor hospital clerical errors, and then having to continually justify and re-explain and ultimately re-experience this trauma, I felt a lack of closure and frustration for an entire year. I could not simply put the whole experience behind me because I did not know how to make the bureaucratic machine work for me, and I did not have an advocate. And I did not and have not had the chance to tell my attacker that he hurt me and that he shouldn't hurt people. I did not need to see him suffer in some sick calculus aimed at maximizing the suffering that a single situation could cause. I did not need this to be an eye for an eye. That would not have felt good, and I don't think it would have solved anything. What I wanted was for this man to take accountability for what he did, apologize from the bottom of his heart, and pledge to never hurt anyone again. And so after taking time thinking and learning, I now know how I would like to answer that police officer's question. Do I want to press charges if the perpetrator is caught? And the answer is no, I do not, I will not, I would not. I want to make it impossible for the harm that I experienced to ever happen again. And pressing charges would not accomplish that. Because here's what would probably happen. Either my assailant would be found not guilty, maybe due to a lack of really specific and concrete evidence. And what would that accomplish? Nothing, except that I might be required to narrate unpleasant memories again to a room of strangers. Or perhaps my assailant would be found guilty and sentenced, a charge that would, in this case, carry a few years in prison, probably longer. And so what is prison? As I see it, prison is a violent place in which people are locked in literal cages. It is not a rehabilitative environment. Prison is a violent place, and it actually increases recidivism. This is a fact that is well supported by decades of empirical research. How can a person live or learn to live without harming when the function of prison is retribution through additional harm endorsed by the state? How does that make any sense? In this vein, punishment and accountability are different. Punishment is the trauma of incarceration and a felony record that makes independent and honest living more or less impossible for the rest of a person's life. Whereas accountability is a robust and relational process that helps people to understand that what they've done and how they can repair what they've done. So accountability is not prison. Those are actually mutually exclusive ideas. And so the last subject that this encounter brings up for me is police, actually, and the system of policing. This year, much of our country has been particularly focused on policing, with national news stories that have chronicled police officers killing Black people for a whole host of ostensible reasons, reasons that will never be good enough to justify killing. I've taken a vow of non-harming, and this vow leads me to believe that there's never a reason to kill a person, particularly not because a person is selling loose cigarettes or paying with a potentially counterfeit bill or robbing a store or making a left turn without a signal or acting unexpectedly in a public place or mouthing off or going for a run or simply existing in Black skin. The fact that police murder people, particularly Black and brown people, disabled people, trans or gender nonconforming people, is not new. This has been happening for decades. And this pattern of violence actually comes from the roots of policing itself. I don't know that we have time today to cover the history of policing and the evolution of policing in the United States. But it is a true statement to say that policing as we know it evolved out of the system of slavery. Some of the earliest versions in America of what we might now refer to as police started to capture runaway slaves and to suppress Black folks in organizing for economic justice. So police evolved to return Black bodies to white slave owners as folks were fighting for the conditions of their freedom. And then as our economic system evolved away from chattel slavery, policing started to serve union busting purposes and as the gateway to incarceration. I encourage everybody who hasn't seen it to take a look at the documentary 13th, which describes how the 13th Amendment has ultimately created a system of mass incarceration that we see today. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, it was part of the emancipation process, but it contains a particular clause that says no person may be enslaved except if they have been convicted of a crime. And so there's this little loophole where folks can be denied the right to liberty and a full life if they are criminals, such that we now have this incentive to make people criminals. And the system of slavery in the late 1800s and early 1900s transformed from what we commonly think of as chattel slavery, an incredibly violent and dehumanizing and awful system of economic power, into a system of mass incarceration that creates profit in different ways. Folks in prison are often working essentially without pay. In California, for example, folks are fighting fires on our behalf, essentially without pay as a condition of their imprisonment. And it's basically slavery in another form. 25% of the world's incarcerated population is in the United States. We have more people in prison here than have ever been in prison at any point in time in the history of the world. And I'm hoping that my little story here, in which I experienced harm in a case that for most folks would say, oh, that's a charge, that's prison worthy, put that person away. That doesn't actually solve things. That doesn't really get at the root of what's happening here. And instead serves to reinforce this narrative of danger and of safety that has real roots in anti-Blackness in America. The idea of what is criminal is created by and perpetuated by these systems of incarceration and punishment. And so this is where the call for abolition comes from, and the call for moving resources away from this apparatus of policing and into more true and real methods of community safety. The things that would have made me safe, and that will in the future, I hope, make all of us safe, are not men with guns patrolling our streets. It's instead creating the conditions that everyone has a life that is worth living, in which they are their own commander and are able to envision a future for themselves and live into that future that is meaningful and compassionate. Imagining ways of preventing and responding to harm without police can be difficult if you've grown up in a body or in a place that has not been the subject of policing and control through the threat or delivery of force. That's how I understand policing now. It is social control through force, whether that force is threatened or actualized. That is the function of police, that and paperwork. And I believe, as deeply as a person can believe, that there are other and better ways of living together, ways that are not mediated by violence and by fear, but that are actually rooted in wise view, wise action, and compassion. This is the language and the vision and the dream of abolition. It's about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions and relationships, as many abolition scholars have taught us. And it's both a specific praxis and a compassionate and generative orientation to living together. Working toward the abolition of police and prisons and surveillance can actually allow us to imagine and create better ways of caring for one another and addressing harm. Ways that are not based in violence, are not based in putting people in cages, are not based on this idea of incarceration and punishment, that are actually more about accountability and repair. A world without police and without punitive imprisonment would actually be a world filled with high quality and free and relevant education. It would be filled with material supports like some degree of guaranteed income and healthcare and housing. It would require reparations for centuries of oppression. It would require community programs and centers and opportunities that support both individual and collective self-determination and dignity, these conditions that keep violence from happening in the first place. Such a world would actually be radically just and would have practices around care and repair that dictate how we respond to harm. And folks have been practicing this and experimenting with this for decades, if not centuries. There are actually many ways out there of dealing with harm, of supporting people who have been harmed in their process of healing, and of working with people who have done harm for them to realize and take accountability for and work to repair what they have done. These are not new ideas, but they're not ideas that have permeated the fabric of our civic life. They tend to exist in communities that have been historically marginalized and oppressed and prevented from accessing what we might consider public life. And I will be the first to admit that we do not have all the answers right now. These systems don't yet exist everywhere and in ways that make it easy to move away from policing or social control through force. But I believe that the work to get there is worth it. And I think this will take time and patience and experimentation and a willingness to really try. But I trust in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And the systems that we have right now, we constructed. They are not inevitable. And as such, I think that they can be deconstructed and transformed in the spirit of the Bodhisattva vow. So really, I see the call of our current moment as one to recognize the history that we have inherited, a history of violence rooted in white supremacy, and see that we actually have another choice, that there's a different way to relate that really centers this idea of transformative justice and the repair of harm, and recognizes that we all cause harm and have been harmed, that this is one of the conditions of being human, and that our ideas about punishment actually may be getting in the way of more radical and liberated justice. So that's what I have to say today. I'm happy to talk about that. I'm happy to talk about whiteness and racial justice more generally or in a different arena. I'm also happy to talk about climate change because that actually is my area of expertise. But in talking with Teresa today about what would be most useful, I thought this story would really ground a lot of the national conversations that are floating around in something quite personal, and maybe open up some questions or ideas with you. So that's what I've got. And at this point, I think maybe we can have a conversation. How does that sound?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank
I
you.
wonder if I wonder if somebody has a question for Lucy. Dave?
Lucy, thank you so much for your talk. I'm sure I'm not the only one whose head is sort of buzzing and exploding with all sorts of follow-up questions and so forth. But
Bring it up.
I did want to ask you about your advice and sort of personal experience about one thing that has come up in previous discussions about this. It's obvious, I guess, even from the vocabulary about these issues, like we talk about racist on the one hand and institutional racism or systemic racism on the other hand, that, you know, there are sort of two ways of looking at this. One is the attitudes and behaviors of each of us as individuals, and the other is that the whole social structure that we're embedded in. And neither of these is the right way to look at this. Instead, of course, we have a horrendously complicated interplay. You know, each of us exists as we do because of the structures that we grow up in, but then the structures are more than just the sort of statistical combination of all of our individual ideas. But I would like to ask you specifically in terms of when each of us interacts, I'm sure we've all had this experience, when we interact with friends, family, other well-meaning people. I'm not talking about, you know, the people carrying torches in the night and chanting racist slogans, but people we know and respect, but we run into this resistance to really confront these issues. And it seems to be a multifaceted combination of sort of guilt, resentment, having grown up with the myth of equality and equal opportunity, anecdotal evidence, even personal experience. And so there's this resistance to this whole process of sort of facing our history as a society and how it's impacted all of us as individuals. I personally find it very difficult in those situations to find the skillful means to discuss this in a way that will help to open the eyes of the person I'm talking to. Anything I say, I'm always afraid is going to generate those sort of defensive reactions, and if anything, encourage them to dig in deeper into their defensiveness and close their ears. Do you have any suggestions about ways that you've found are fruitful ways in one-on-one conversations like that to address these issues?
Sure thing. I'm also seeing, Tova, you've raised a hand. Is it about this question, or is this to cue yourself next? What would be useful there?
It's to cue myself next. I'm awaiting what you have to say, and I had some thoughts as well.
Sounds great. So in no particular order, things that come up for me in response to this question of what do I do as somebody who is concerned about racial justice and working with white folks on seeing our history and working to repair it, knowing that those insights are not are actively discouraged by the world in which we live, that it takes a degree of work and vulnerability to move toward them. The first thing I hold in mind is the remembrance that two things are true simultaneously. One, the work of racial justice is incredibly urgent, that people are dying because of the systems of white supremacy. And while that is true, this is the work of a lifetime, and that the call is for skillful means, and sometimes skillful means takes patience and time and relationship. And so in these conversations, I remind myself that no one conversation has to fix it all. That any one conversation that I have is planting a seed and hoping that from that seed comes change, and that I am committed to the process of change with that person in whatever way I can, given the context of our relationship. So that's one thing. It's a little bit of a pressure relief valve, not as a way to say, oh, it's not about me, I can exempt myself, but rather I will do the best I can with what I've got. That will have to be enough, and I will continue the work. So that's one thought. The second thought is, I think most folks who would not consider themselves white supremacist in the really reductive way of understanding it, people who believe wholeheartedly that everyone is equal at a really ultimate level, may not have actually thought through all of their thoughts as they relate to that conviction or that principle. For example, I adopt a definition of racism that says that anything that produces a negative and differential outcome differentiated by race is racist, such that, for example, poor maternal health outcomes for Black women is engineered. That is not natural. That is not a condition of Blackness independent of white supremacy. Or alternatively, rates of incarceration and conviction that are differential along racial lines, also not natural. Blackness is not criminality. Blackness is that those patterns of quote unquote criminality are produced by the system of white supremacy. That any of these things out there that produce differential outcomes by race are racist, and not because of inherent inequality across race. And so when I work with folks and trying to understand this, when people say, oh, that's not racist, I'm not racist, I start to really poke at that and say, well, then why are we seeing these phenomena around us? What could explain this? Either there's this idea that, no, actually races are not equal and that this is a natural outcome of culture or whatever. Or actually that we have systems that are actively perpetuating and maintaining these patterns that we see. And if people are, living by their principles, they tend to arrive slowly at the realization that this is a structure, this is not a natural condition, and that because it's a structure, we can do something about it. That's another thought that I think. And I also hold for folks in these conversations as much compassion as I can, though sometimes I'm frustrated and impatient, because we live in a world that, because so much of our economic system is predicated on racial hierarchy, there is active disincentive to waking up to whiteness. It is so easy as a white person in America to live without any conscious understanding of race because the systems around us try to make it so. And unlearning that is hard and emotional, which doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done and does not let white people off the hook. It's just part of the process that reminds me to operate from a position of humility and compassion in relationship. And then lastly, if I find that I'm not really making progress and there's something at stake, for example, I'm in a professional context in which someone's public behavior is actively harming a Black or Indigenous person, I set really clear boundaries and say, I disagree with you on that. I find that that is actively harmful. I'm not going to engage that now. If you want to talk about it later in a different venue, we can, but I would like to say right now that I'm not on board with this. And that doesn't need to be an unkind thing. I actually just see it as firm. And I remind myself that boundaries matter and that boundaries are the distance at which I can love both you and me simultaneously. And sometimes that means the cessation of harm in a moment and a willingness to revisit something later. So I don't know if that's helpful. It's not particularly specific. We can certainly talk through individual circumstances, but that's what comes to mind for me.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy. It is helpful, and especially your counseling of compassion and patience in these situations. To quote a friend of mine from a completely different context, tiny steps for tiny feet. We have to recognize our own limitations in dealing with these huge issues, even as we see how incredibly large and deeply entrenched they are. And so it is difficult to conjure up enough compassion and patience in these situations when we're dealing with somebody one-on-one. But thank you for those helpful suggestions. I appreciate it.
Tova, you have some thoughts? Would love to hear it.
Am I unmuted? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So I did have some thoughts. I really appreciate the fullness, completeness of your response, Lucy. And I just wanted to share that for those of us who think of ourselves as white people, which I used to think of myself as, and someone who has been was active as a young person in the civil rights movement and been working on unlearning my own racism. It's been very hard. It was very hard. I don't feel it's so hard right now to really see how I'm part of this white supremacist culture or the structural racism in our society. And yet there's actually nowadays no way not to see it, you know, just in terms of how COVID-19 impacts communities of color in a much more devastating way than it does white communities. And that's how children who are not able to attend school, children of color find it harder, much harder to study at home. Sometimes they don't have a stable environment. They don't have access to Wi-Fi. And, you know, it's just to see this systemic racism, it is so apparent now. And I think when you're talking to family members, they probably heard some of these things, read them, noticed them. So I think that's a doorway into helping other people make that shift from, you know, I think we experience, or we can experience whiteness on an individual level and a much wider level as well. It's not one or the other, it's both. It's both individual and structural. You know, some of the ways in which we as white people are conditioned affect how we see people of color, and we may not be conscious of some of those ways. And I just say one other thing that I think can be helpful is talking with other white people about this who are reading, learning, questioning. You know, I think that's one of the reasons why we offer this Unpacking Whiteness class at San Francisco Zen Center. And it's a chance to realize that we need to help each other as white people in this journey, learn from each other, support each other with compassion as we look at this issue, because it's so hard to see. Thanks.
Anybody else? If not, I'll ask a question. Don?
That was a tremendous talk, Lucy. So clear, wonderful. You know, this issue about talking with people, what I've discovered in my interactions with people about things we disagree about is that people their beliefs are actually functional. They don't just really have these beliefs. These beliefs serve a function. And it seemed to me that I discovered that function was to validate and defend both their identity and their worldview. So when I was engaged in these discussions, and I would be disagreeing and offering evidence and data and this and that, it didn't matter. Because what was really going on was their very identity was threatened by what I was offering. And those views, I discovered later on, were not even their own views, really. They were views that they adopted from the culture that is created by this class system we have. And white supremacy itself is a symptom of classism. So I was just wondering what you thought about that in terms of, I mean, we have a system that is based on the exploitation of people.
Mhm. Yep.
Plain and simple. And that's good. And that's always going to result in injustice and all, you know. So what do you have any thoughts about altering this system? Because I think it's going to take a major overhaul of the system. But I don't know.
Yeah, perfect diagnosis in my opinion.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
This comes a lot actually up in my work in climate justice, believe it or not, which is, I mean, I see racial justice and climate justice and economic justice and all these other forms of working to recognize the inherent dignity of all people as being very much part and parcel of the same project and fight, just different lenses. What I have noticed, and maybe you have noticed this too, is that in the United States, at least, I can only speak to my own context. I observe a system at both micro and macro levels that by default is not a system of care, right? It's a very individualized system that focuses on the possibility for the individual to accumulate immense wealth at all expenses. That's what we have before us. And that system is deeply intertwined with colonialism and white supremacy as two different ways of saying very similar things, to the point where it's hard to know where one begins and other ends and what is the chicken and what is the egg. But I think it's just a fundamental statement to say we don't actually have structures in place that care for people first, regardless of the profit context. This is where things like Medicare for all and guaranteed basic income, universal basic income programs, to me seem really essential. And so when I think, for example, about climate justice, the thing that would actually promote climate justice in a very central way, in a way that would be emissions mitigating and allow for the impacts of climate change to not be so desperately felt and differentially felt along sort of traditional oppressive structures, would be building these systems of care and dismantling the capitalist structures that incentivize profit over people. It requires a different economic model, quite frankly, because the one we have inherited is rooted in, as you mentioned, the exploitation of bodies for the ultimate profit of a few. And that requires getting super real with what is your own personal economic context. And this is work that I'm trying to do right now for myself and finding to be incredibly difficult, because the work of the individual in recognizing our economic embedding is hard to do without having this bigger social change, right? For me as an individual to try to live from a place of abundance that doesn't focus on the accumulation of personal wealth feels impossible when there are no safety nets out there. So for example, I'm finding myself caught up in the rat race of trying to dump as much money as I can into a 401k for my own personal gain in ways that actually perpetuate our climate apocalypse because of the investment profiles that are available to me. And there's no way out of that for me right now, because as I anticipate my future, when and if I end up in retirement and old age, there's no alternative. And so I'm probably out on a tangent here, but I think it's important to try to envision and imagine other economic structures that are not predicated on perpetual growth and wealth inequality. Some of that then starts to get to the territory of what I would call prefigurative politics, where this idea that what we do on a micro scale, in an interpersonal sense, in a communal sense, has repercussions for the larger spaces and structures that govern our lives. So how I relate to people in my own life opens up spaces of possibility for that behavior and those ideas to ripple out. So this is where reparations comes in. How can I personally practice reparations to redistribute the bounties of white supremacy? How can I work in community to build financing models that are, as is often happening in Buddhist contexts, oriented around gift economics or dana, that make things radically accessible to all independent of financial resources. None of this stuff is easy, but it's worth trying. So that's my idea. You know, if I offer it up in one sentence, I personally am calling for the abolition of carbon-based racial capitalism, but that's the project of an entire civilization.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you, brilliant, thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I think Umar had a question, right? Lee?
Yeah, I'm here. I do have a question. Uh, I mean, I want to pick up where you ended, which is that, we need money to take care of ourselves. That is just very important, because even the kind of work that you're doing, without taking care of yourself, you won't be able to take care of other people. That just is basic Buddhism. We have to take care of ourselves to take care of other people. That's one thing. The other thing, that all the stuff that you've been talking about, reparations and Native Americans and uh, doing like African American women not being given enough importance to. I was reading a report about the pregnancies that they were going through weren't given, importance than white women, and things like that are important. But one of the things that I'm seeing is we keep talking about systematic racism, but we don't talk about changing the system, which is, nobody talks about building a trust which will provide, which takes money from different for-profit organizations or corporations or people who are making tons of money, and siphons it in a way that it gives it to people who are really have had really gruesome stuff happen to them in the past, meaning the Native Americans, African Americans, setting up a trust, setting up areas where they can build, where they can do things. There's no such thing. I was watching this documentary called The End of Poverty, and a lot of the money that is coming in from corporations is actually going out of the United States to NGOs. We don't have NGOs within the United States that are taking care of our people, yet we want to go around taking care of the people around the rest of the world. That is well and good, but we need to take care of our own problems. And this is what I keep seeing with this country, that we keep trying to put a great face in front of everybody else and saying, oh, how wonderful we are, instead of really rolling up our sleeves and getting deep down into our work, into our own lives. Love is important. Compassion, kindness. I don't like to use the word compassion because it's something that has, just like Zen, it has become something like a trademark and people are trading it. I call it kindness. We can learn to be kind to each other. Start by being kind to each other, regardless of the fact of the matter what your skin color is, regardless of the matter what our sexual orientation is. But out of this kindness should come this whole idea of community building. It's all about building communities. Everybody needs to be included. We have different skin colors, so we have different facial features, so we can actually not separate, but sort of identify each other from the other person. If everybody looked the same, we won't be able to tell the differences, who's to who. But my point that I'm making is that there has to be some kind of a trust or some kind of systematic change. And this has to come from the ground up. It won't come from up top down, because that's what has been failing us. That is not working anymore. And we have to do something to set up a system that does something like that gives people, and we have to start with ourselves, with the kindness that we have towards each other, and move it outward, and let let it grow to a point, becomes a trust. It becomes a place where we can actually start pooling our resources and helping people out, because there's enough to go around. It's not like there's not enough to go around. There's more money. I mean, Oprah has more money than quote unquote God, and she can easily open up hospitals. She can open up clinics, but people don't want to because it has never been brought into their consciousness. There are lots of people out there who are suffering, and suffering doesn't need to be eradicated because it can't be eradicated. That it'll always be with us. It's just a human condition. Human condition is a suffering, and there are problems, and we are here to solve those problems. And the way to solve these problems is to do something about it. And personally, I was listening to you, and this is what came to my mind, that this is really a human issue more than it is a racial or any of these kinds of issues. And there's a lack of kindness. We need to institute some kind of kindness into our system, and we need to bring in some kind of trust or some kind of pooling of resources that actually goes ahead and helps communities. I was watching news story yesterday that there's this man who has, I think it's called Health for Homies or something like that. They have a truck, and they feed 2,000 people every day in Oakland. And their truck was stolen, which has a big mural on it. And the people who stole it took away the catalytic converter. So the truck had to be towed, and the community came together and fixed the truck and gave it back to the people. So more people can be helped, more people. So now, since the stories come out, people are helping them out, and they're getting a refrigerated truck that will take the food to the streets, and so they can set it up and people can come by and pick up food. One of the biggest problems that I'm seeing with COVID, people are talking about rent. Rent is important, but people are not getting fed. There's not enough food to go around. People are not being fed. And this is a very big problem that we're facing, that we don't have enough um, basic things that are available to people, like food. So I just want to bring this up. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with your perspective that there is enough to go around. I think that is fundamentally true. And for me, the call for reparations is urgent, that it matters that we put our money where our mouth is. I deeply value, to speak in the language of the Bay Area, the work of Anand Giridas, who argues, I think quite convincingly, that philanthropy is actually doing us a disservice, that we live in a society in which people can accumulate billions of dollars, and then the idea of social good becomes privatized, that our ability to provide for ourselves and one another is dependent on the whims of billionaires. And that is a fundamental wrong, in my opinion, to the point where we need radical political action and radical economic structures that prohibit and prevent the accumulation of mass wealth. That to me is incredibly clear. So that is where structures of governance that move toward a socialized program, socialism, matter to me. I think the devil's always in the details, and we don't have time to get into the details of economic policy here. But it matters to me that we move away from a system of philanthropy. That's the first thing that I would say, such that we're not living in a system where we rely on charity to take care of people. It needs to be much more robust and much more institutionalized at the state level. To the point where I encourage folks who are excited about this topic to write down the term nonprofit industrial complex and read about it. It's a frame of thinking and of theorizing that recognizes the intimate connection between capitalism and nonprofit as a way to solve problems. So there's a thought. The second thought for me is that kindness absolutely matters. And it matters that we are engaging politically, that we are organizing, that folks are mobilizing, and that it's our personal relationships and our relationships with the political sphere are both given equal importance. It's a both and for me. I think that in the spirit of interconnection, we need to take care of people in our backyards, and we need to take care of people across the world, because increasingly our futures are intertwined as we see a global pandemic, as we see a climate apocalypse, as our atmosphere fills with emissive molecules. Both matter. And I think collectively we have enough to do it all, and it just might require that each of us takes a first step and picks something that matters to us in a degree where we have a sphere of influence. So those are my thoughts. Teresa, I'm seeing a hand from you.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. You were talking about having a different system, that this system was invented so we can come up with a different system. And, you know, I've been in Spain now for a few months, and I can see, for example, you know, universal healthcare really makes a difference. Really, really makes a difference. So yeah, I hope that can be changed in the US. But my question is kind of related to what just Umar said. You know, lately I've been thinking about human nature. You were saying that we all have Buddha nature, right? Somehow, lately, I don't know why exactly I've been thinking about human nature, the fact that Buddha lived already more than 2,000 years ago, and we as humans, we haven't really made progress. You know, we create still so much suffering and harm. And you were saying, well, you know, we have this system, but a completely different system, a system that is more fair, that creates more happiness and well-being. We can have that, but why is it so difficult, you know? So my question to you, and you do work around racial issues and climate change, as you refer several times, you said climate apocalypse. Those are two areas where you can really see, you know, the harm that we create on the environment, our mother nature, on other beings. So I wonder if you have reflected on that. Is there anything wrong with us, with humans, human species? Why is it so difficult for us to create a different world, you know, to realize our Buddha nature? I don't know, I wanted to hear your thoughts.
Well, there's the question of a lifetime. I think a lot of different people have a lot of different ways of answering this. I mean, I think there's certainly a Buddhist view that greed, hatred, and delusion are persistent, and it is the job of each of us to wake up to that. I think that the personal awakening needs to synergize with the collective awakening, that those are different ways of the same process that feed synergistically. I think there are also folks with whom I work, for example, that have a very evolutionary perspective, that understand many of our problems as relating to a fast-paced technological world, while we still have animal brains. That part of the challenge is that our environment that we currently inhabit is not the environment in which we evolved, such that our ability to hold the scale of the world around us as an individual is just mismatched, that we cannot possibly comprehend of the consequences of all of our actions, and that we have evolved in a context of danger and of scarcity. And now that those things no longer exist, you know, we're not subject to blizzards looking for woolly mammoth in Siberia. We are struggling to let go of those limbic structures that are so very easily triggered into cycles of fear and anger. So some of this, I think, actually probably has an evolutionary explanation, though I myself am not an evolutionary biologist by training. I just happen to work with some folks. I think also one of the challenges is that each of us is so very small, and that can be a beautiful thing to realize and a terrifying thing to realize all at once. That the sphere of influence that any one person has is generally not very big. And we're each doing the best that we can. And life is hard. And we're trying to add it all up into something much bigger than any one of ourselves. And what complexity and what unpredictability that is. I think there are folks who would argue that we're better off than we've ever been. And I think that that is true. And that does not necessarily negate the fact that there's still incredible harm and suffering out there. Both natural harm and suffering and social harm and suffering. But that many of us are living longer than we ever have. That we have incredible technologies that allow us to relate to one another and create art and dream up fanciful ideas and see across literally the entire universe back 14 billion years in time and space. Like, all of this is really incredible stuff. And we still have problems because welcome to the world, as unsatisfying as that may be. And to me, the task or the duty or, the beautiful obligation of picking up my small part of the world and saying, what can I do to make this better? I'll do what I can with what I've got, as, this little flickering being that I am, is worthwhile. My training actually is in geology, such that I have a pretty deep reverence for geologic time. The fact that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, the universe is almost 14 billion years old. And somehow all of it matters and none of it matters. And the long perspective can be useful. So I got a little poetic there, but there you have it.
And maybe last question from Lee.
Yes, I just wanted to say that on the topic of creating community help programs, we've seen that when the very rich and powerful in this country want to hold on to power, they're willing to release. They find the funds to help people. It's like the stimulus package where they sent out $1,200 to every family making under $75,000 a year and such things. Most of the really ultra wealthy in this country are parking large portions of their fortunes offshore, so they're not even paying taxes into the general fund. If people were more fairly taxed and everyone was on board with it, we would be able to support everyone in this country, all communities, with education, with healthcare, with good housing, with a decent life for all of us. And as you pointed out, when everybody is being taken care of, there's way less incentive for there to be any kind of crime on the lower levels. On the upper levels, there are always upper levels, meaning the people who are the greediest, trying to find ways to become even more wealthy than the fabulous wealth they already have. So, I mean, if we recognize that in this country, it's not a matter of socialism. It's not a matter of having a different form of government. We should always maintain a democratic form of government, but with the very wealthiest should be taxed fairly, and the resources of the country should be used for the good of all of the communities in the country, rather than for the crazy things that our money is wasted on in this society. So that was just a side note to what has been said about taking care of people. We have the resources to take care of each other, and we really need to have the will to use those resources for good.
Mm-hmm. And to me, that means a diversity of tactics. That means voting. Vote like your life depends on it, because it does, and so does everybody else's. To me, that means direct action. That means being in the streets. That means organizing for collective power, because no one individual in this incredibly unequal system has much to say at all, especially when corporations are people. So it's always for me a call for radical participatory politics. And voting is not enough. It's essential, but is not enough.
Dave, some final comments?
Yes, well, I'm sure I'm not the only one in this conversation who could keep talking about this based on what Lucy said until about 4 in the afternoon, but of course we can't do that. I just wanted in closing to again, thank you, Lucy, so much for this, and to, well, there's a very important, I'm a computer scientist, and there's a very important computer scientist in the history of the field about whom they used to say, I don't know what happens, but every time he enters a room, everybody else's IQ goes up by 20 points. And I think that's really what you've done for us today. So thank you so much for inspiring this conversation.
That's so meaningful to hear that. And as
Yes.
somebody whose life is very computational, I think I've heard that quote.
Yeah, I just want to say I absolutely love this, and you like are a light, a ray of hope. I mean, like, you
Yes.
know, and I see this, there's lots of young people like you who are very passionate and very informed. And so I see, it makes me optimistic. And I just really, really appreciate this morning. Thank you so much.
Yes, I want to second that too, Lucy. I think with people like you, we are hopeful. And I'm very grateful to Tova, who I know loves you very much, for introducing you. I really enjoyed your wonderful presentation this morning and the way you engaged with us in the Q&A. So thank you very much. I hope we will keep the relationship and you can come visit us, as I said, to Mountain View sometime in the future. Thank you.
My pleasure and my privilege. It's been such a lovely chance to get to talk with you all today. And I hope you find some respite and some joy in your Saturday afternoons or whatever the heck time it is for you, thinking about you, Teresa. So may you be peaceful and at ease, and let's stay in touch.
Yes, Liz.
Thank you, Lucy. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.